Aurelius, you agree with me that one of the challenges that has been raised is the lack of access to these funds by developing countries. When nations meet at a global stage, there are a lot of pledges that are made, and these pledges are meant to go towards addressing some of these climate concerns. But what ends up happening is that very few or limited funds actually reach these nations in order for them to address all these climate risks. Where is the challenge, and how do you think we can address that?
Despite strong commitments, there are, gaps we must address. And I'll highlight, a few. The first is that, the pledges that are coming in, or the pledges that have been made towards climate finance, most of them are not translating into, disbursements. A report done by the OECD, indicates that only around 2/3 of the committed climate finance, is actually delivered. Now, this tells you that it's one thing to make commitments in terms of pledges, but it's another to disperse those resources. But this, of course, hinges on a number of issues. There are issues to deal with transparency. There are issues to do with trust. There are issues to deal with the Ben ratio. There are issues to deal with the capacity of the institutions, the countries themselves, to actually, utilize those resources, hence, increasing donor confidence. So all these things, still affect the aspect of conversion of such pledges into actual disbursement. So I must make mention that one of the challenges that needs to be addressed is the fact of translating most of the pledges that have been made into actual disbursements. If there's a way, there needs to be found a way that helps us to address the challenge of translating pledges into actual commitments. That's one gap that needs to be addressed. The other issue is the imbalance in terms of funding that goes towards adaptation as well as mitigation. Now, you find that over 85% of climate finance supports mostly mitigation, and this leaves quite just but a fraction that goes towards adaptation. And hence, we find that for most of the countries that are actually, very much affected by the impacts of climate change, in this case, mostly the developing countries, including mostly African states as well as small islands, they do require more of investments going towards adaptation. And we find that there is just but a small percentage that goes towards adaptation finance, and hence it is important that this issue also needs to be addressed to see how best then this balance can be reached. For many countries, this challenge remains quite significant. It's a bit too complex for them to access, just to even navigate around the bureaucracies that are found around accessing these resources, meeting the requirements, meeting the fiduciary standards of accessing these resources remains quite a huge challenge for most of the developing countries and most of the communities that need those resources. The other critical challenge that we find, and that also is actually also inhibiting access to these resources, is the limited capacity to develop bankable proposals. And this is a huge challenge in a number of developing states. Now, many of these developing states are still having a lot of challenges to develop bankable proposals, at the same time also to just come up with a clear climate rationale that makes their proposals, meet the investment criteria. Now, I must make mention that, Jacob, finance does not flow in a vacuum, but rather it flows in the direction of readiness, it flows in the direction of opportunity, it also flows in the direction of partnerships. If I can zoom in on the aspect of readiness, it is those countries, it is those institutions that have invested, a lot in being ready, a lot in putting up readiness, plans, readiness environments, understanding, putting up research, feasibility assessments that clearly give evidence that can back their climate rationale and then plug into the actual project design, are the ones that are going to be able to access most of the resources. Why? Because they are ready. If peradventure at a point there are some funds that are available, it is those that are ready that will meet the necessary requirements. At the same time, it is those countries that have observed and are looking out for specific opportunities out there. At times it might be opportunities in adversity, within the complication, within the challenge that they are having. It might be through a hurricane maybe that has hit a country. It is a sad situation, but within that sad situation, countries that have got readiness plans, countries that are prepared, will easily access resources to address some of those challenges. So it is important to understand that to improve on access to climate finance, they need to be ready. They need to invest in feasibility assessments. They need to invest in research. They need to invest in data collection. They need to invest in building capacity, both institutional capacity as well as human capacity, for purposes of developing these bankable proposals. But at the same time, they need to also leverage on partnerships, leverage on key partnerships that they can have with strategic partners, and see how best they can access resources through those key partnerships. The other challenge that I would want to talk about also is the limited data availability, to build evidence, and that would then inform the climate rationale. I did earlier allude to this one as well. Mostly you find that we just do not have enough data, especially in the African continent. We find that most of the information that is required to feed into proposals, to inform decision makers, to inform investors, is not just readily available, and hence it becomes a huge challenge, leading me to the other point of a high perceived risk. Because of not having enough information, it creates an information asymmetry, and where there is that information asymmetry, the cost of capital also goes up. And because the cost of capital has also gone up, and also because there is not enough information, it creates a risk, and hence when there is a high risk, it means that the cost of borrowing, if at all the country would want to borrow, would actually go up, even for SMEs, for other project developers that want to do a certain project in a particular area. If there isn't enough information around, if there isn't enough available data, it becomes quite difficult to actually just first package the proposal itself. At the same time, it becomes quite difficult to access capital to invest in that project, simply because there isn't just enough information. If one is to access some resources for that project, it means they have to pay quite some substantial amounts in terms of return on investments. So it's important for countries to ensure that there is, or they invest in generating enough data for purposes of building evidence. At the same time, if there isn't enough information, there isn't enough data, there isn't enough capacity, it threatens and challenges some of the trust that might be there. At the same time, if also financing is not balanced, there is more going towards mitigation and less going towards adaptation. Countries that are more, more concerned about adaptation would lose the trust that they need to have in certain investments because of that imbalance. At the same time, also, if resources are just not being dispersed despite being pledged, if the disbursement is not happening compared to the pledges that are happening, that have been pledged, it also erodes the trust that is there, mostly between developed countries as well as developing countries. Now, how do we then, fix this challenge? How do we then fix this challenge? There are four key shifts that we need to embrace in trying to address this challenge. The first one is to simplify access. It's important that even the funds themselves find means and ways of simplifying access. I must commend the Green Climate Fund, who have, at least at this point, tried and are working very hard to try to streamline and simplify access. Currently, they have now gone into a model where they would have actually regional representation. We do have the directorate or the department for the Green Climate Fund in Africa, which also helps with trying to streamline or trying to simplify some of these access modalities. So it's important that the funds themselves do simplify access to these climate funds. They simplify or streamline the application procedures, harmonize the standards, and also see how best these funds can actually now trickle down and go to the local communities themselves. The second point, or rather the second shift that we need to embrace is to invest in systems and not just projects. Invest in systems and not just projects. We need climate finance embedded in national budgets, public investment plans, and long-term development frameworks, and not just pushing resources into one-time projects. We need to move away from just making investments or pushing resources into one-time projects that at the end of the project it ends there. But rather we need to find ways of how these climate finances can be plugged into the normal development process of a particular country. So invest in the actual systems that are existing in a particular country through maybe national budgets, through public investment plans, and any other systems that the countries might have that are actually currently existing, rather than investing in specific projects. Others would call it a programmatic approach, others would call it a systems thinking approach, and the like. So this is another area that can be looked at in terms of trying to address this challenge. The third point is that we need to use this concessional finance that is available as basically a catalyst, not a means to, rather a major key financing for a particular project alone, but rather look at it as a catalyst. So public finance should de-risk and mobilize larger flows of private capital, especially in emerging markets, as well as especially in Africa. It should be used to invest in readiness activities that reduce information asymmetry, as well as it should be used to create an enabling environment. It should be used to identify climate risks, it should be used to do feasibility assessments for purposes of leveraging other bigger resources, in this case even private capital. So when we try to get or use public funds, in this case it can even be concessional financing itself, let this concessional finance be used to catalyze, or rather to mobilize even private capital. And this way we are going to scale the type of investments that we're making in addressing climate change. And the fourth one, in this case, the last one, is that we need to empower local actors. Fund the communities, the municipalities, the local organizations directly, because these are the ones that are closest, to the challenges that we're trying to address. So let funds trickle down or go directly also to the local actors themselves. In this case, the municipalities, the local community organizations, the small groupings at the local level. So these are the ones that we need to also focus on, because they are actually directly linked to the challenges that we want to